The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how yous doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Today we're going to take you behind the scenes at Citizens Bank Ballpark, specifically to the service level, where the video production room is located. Tucked away in a corner is a small separate room that houses 3 monitors, an audio mixer, walls decorated with framed photos of former Phillies, and piles and stacks of VHS, cassettes, and CDs. This is the office of Dan Stephenson, the Phillies videographer, who has been with the club since 1982. Known affectionately within the Phillies organization as Video Dan, Stephenson has taken us down memory lane on Fanavision with sentimental features of teams and players of the past. He's written and produced more than 20 documentaries that give permanence to our treasured memories of great Phillies like Richie Ashburn, Mike Schmidt, and Steve Carlton, as well as some of the greatest teams in the club's storied past, including the 1980 and 2008 World Series winners and that wild, wacky, and wonderful 93 team led by Darren Dalton, Lenny Dykstra, John Kruk, and Mitch Williams. In the process, Video Dan won a Mid-Atlantic Regional Emmy Award in 1999 for his first documentary, Flashback, A Century of Phillies Baseball, and became a trusted friend of many Phillies who study his tapes of their at-bats, provide him with candid interviews, and sometimes even include him in their clubhouse hijinks. In every sense, Video Dan Stephenson has been a valued member of the Phillies family for 35 years. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. Good to be here.
Let's go back to 1981 when you were tending bar at Downey's restaurant. I understand that one night Chris Wheeler, a member of the Phillies PR department, walks in and mentions that the team needs a part-time video person after learning that you had a small video business. 3 weeks later, Bill Giles, who had recently become president of the Phillies, walks into the restaurant to have dinner with his partners who had just purchased the team. Giles, acting on a tip from Wheels, offers you the job, and you promptly said no. What's up with that?
Well, that's not quite exactly how it happened. When Wheels first mentioned it, he said, "You know, we need a video guy," and that's when I said, "Yeah, right, sure you do." Which it would have been the equivalent of somebody saying, "I have a check for $1 million. How do you spell your name on it?" You know, I just didn't take it too seriously because I was such a huge Phillies fan that it was ridiculous that somebody would come into the bar and say, "Hey, you know, we need somebody. Why don't you apply for the job?" And I really didn't even take it seriously. And then what happened was 3 weeks later, there was a party for the new ownership, and Larry Shank actually came up and said, "Hey, you know, we're looking for somebody." And I'm like, maybe there is something to this. And then literally a half hour later, Larry introduced me to Bill, and he said, "Oh, welcome aboard." And I just said, "Yeah, okay," and the rest is history, as they say. But that was in the days well before background checks and all that sort of thing. And it was just one of those amazing stories that happened. I know there have been a few career days at the ballpark, and somebody says, "Why don't you tell these kids how you got the job?" I said, "No, because their teachers wouldn't appreciate that, you know, it was completely random, and I got the job because I was tending bar, not because of my qualifications or anything." But
Wow.
it worked out great. They said, can you be in spring training? I said, "I think I can arrange my schedule for that." Of course, I had no schedule at all. So I remember going down 1982 to Clearwater and thinking, there's no way I'm keeping this job. It's like a dream job. It's just too good to be true. And somehow I've managed to make it to my 37th season. So it has been. It's been like a magic carpet ride and a dream come true all in one. And it's for 99% of it, it's been a blast.
So, Dan, what was your very first assignment, going down to Clearwater and just taping the hitters and the pitchers?
Yeah, exactly. And I would set up behind home plate and with a VHS camera and tapes, and I would tape the games. And literally the entire spring, nobody watched a single tape. I'm thinking, oh, boy, this this isn't going to work out too good. And really what it was back in those days, guys went to spring training to get in shape. They didn't go in there to look at their mechanics or their, where their pitches were or anything like that. And it wasn't really until the season started that players started coming back and looking at video. And, I did the same thing at the vet. I would be behind home plate with a VHS camera. And then we'd have guys that would come back regularly and take a look at their mechanics and where their hands were and where their feet were and where their arm slot was and all that stuff. And so, it wound up being a useful tool, but it was just funny. The first spring there, literally nobody, except maybe the last couple of days, looked at any videotape. I was starting to think, boy, they don't need me. This isn't going to last. But somehow it lasted, and it all worked out.
Now, I understand that you also taped the road games at home and then broke them down so the players could check that
started probably in a couple of years. There were a couple of guys that said, hey, man, I had a really good hitting streak on the road. How come I don't have those taped? I said, well, we can do that. So I would just tape the broadcast and then break down each batter and pitcher with his own tape. And so when they got off the road, they could come in and look at it. And it's amazing nowadays, there's literally a staff of 3 or 4 guys, and not only is every single at-bat taped immediately for them to look at, but say, for example, and a good example of this would be Chase Utley would come into the video room in the last few years and say, I want to see every left-hander in this bullpen. Say we're playing the Mets. He goes, I want to see every left-hander the Mets have, and I want to see just their first pitch. And literally they could dial that up and show it to them in a matter of seconds. And that's the beauty of the digital world, which, back then it was all analog VHS tapes, which, as you accurately described, I still have a few in my office hanging around. But nowadays it's such a modern science, and it's fascinating to see what these guys have at their fingertips. Whereas the old school guys, we used to joke about Babe Ruth didn't have videotape, so it was a burgeoning, escapade at the beginning of that. That was the first time teams started using video. Was probably late 70s, early 80s, and the Phillies were one of the first teams to have a full-time guy doing it. So I feel pretty good that we were at the beginning of that, and technologically we were right up around the top of baseball.
Mm-hmm. So you literally broke those tapes down manually and put them back together again. You reorganized them for each hitter and each pitcher. I mean, that must have taken a lot of time.
Yeah, it was a little bit tedious, but it was fun too. It was fun to watch the games. I would basically tape them as they happen, and sometimes just do it that way. Just literally change tapes while the game was going on per at bat. And then I would keep a master copy of the game if I missed something. So it a lot of times it was just basically watching a baseball game, and then just keep flipping tapes every time a new performance came in.
So tell me, who were some of the first Phillies to take advantage of that, what was then in the late 70s, a new technology?
Well, again, I started in 82. The first guy that I would say watched a majority of his at-bats was Joe Morgan, and that was, of course, in 83. He came along. And it was funny because Pete Rose never watched video. The only time he wanted to see tape is if he argued either a ball or a strike, or he argued a call at one of the bases. And he was usually right, on his side of the argument. Mike Schmidt would watch periodically. He would usually watch tape when he wasn't going well, and he would try to figure out what he was doing wrong compared to when he was going well. And usually he'd take his tapes home with him, spend a couple days, and then go in the batting cage and try to correct his mistakes. Steve Carlton never watched anything. It was funny. A lot of times a younger pitcher would get shelled in a game and come back in the video room and start watching it. And the older veteran pitchers would come back and say, don't watch that. You're watching, it's not good for your confidence to see you get beat twice. You've already seen this once. Don't look at it a second time. And, so that was always a rule of thumb with those guys.
That's really fascinating. I mean, there was some blowback from, the old time guys, but then you had a guy like Morgan who, became a student of the tape. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, Joe was one of those guys that always wanted an edge. He liked to study pitchers to see if he could read their tells when it came to going to the plate or throwing over to first. And he was a master of that. I don't really think he needed videotape. He and guys like Davey Lopes could watch a pitcher and figure out how to run on him. And they were unbelievable students of the game. But he would take any edge he could, and part of that edge was watching videotape.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite videos you did was the Schmidt's chasing the 500 home run mark in 1987, and you partnered with Mike Tolan, who at that time had a video company in New York. I understand that Mike Tolan wrote the script and you did the filming, correct?
Well, no, actually, what happened was, I had met Mike. Mike had done a movie called Centennial, which was the 100th anniversary of Phillies history. He had done it with Major League Productions and then went out on his own, and he proposed to David Montgomery that we document Schmidt's quest for 500 home runs because he only needed 5, and it was the beginning of the season. So they followed Mike all the way through spring training, and then Mike Tolan wanted to make sure each at bat was recorded, and there was a separate camera, not a television camera, but an independent camera recording the 5 home runs. So he knew I worked in the clubhouse. We became close friends after that. And he got me a broadcast camera to use, and I had permission to go down in the dugout when Mike was at bat and actually shoot over, I guess at that time it would have been Pat Corrales. No, it would have been Lee Elia's shoulder. And so I was in the dugout with a camera shooting Mike's at bats, and then a couple times he did hit a home run, and we'd get the post-game celebration in the clubhouse. And of course, Mike hit the 500th in Pittsburgh, and Mike Tolan had a film crew there that really accurately captured all the excitement of that, which was great because it was a big home run and a big part of the game. And Mike and I developed a really close friendship, and the next year, Mike proposed that I shoot a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff and that his company would make the highlight film. So that was before I was writing or editing anything. And we did that for a couple of years, and then after I felt comfortable, I said, Mike, I think I'd like to try to edit it and produce this myself. And then he and I actually combined at that point in 1991 on the Phillies Home Companion series. And the first one I ever edited was the John Kruk. It was called What a Ride. And Mike and I teamed up together for a couple more after that, and we still remain very close to this day. And Mike has gone on to much bigger and better things, but we still have a very good relationship, and we talk all the time about mostly Phillies baseball and other things. But Mike really was the one that gave me my start as a producer and editor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to get to the Home Companions, but I want to go back just a second. That film that documented Schmidt's 500 home run chase, that was a wonderful tribute to Mike. It allowed the fans to go behind the scenes and learn more about him as a person, which he's a very private person. So that must have been very challenging filming him because he does value his privacy. How did you gain his trust?
Well, I had been in the clubhouse, so Mike and I were friendly, and he knew who I was, and really all I was shooting was his at bats, and then if there was a home run, we'd shoot him in the clubhouse with his teammates, and that's kind of the genesis of the Phillies Home Companion series, which previously MLB Productions would do the highlight films, and they were very generic. They were just basically highlights oriented, and there wasn't a lot of behind the scenes stuff. And Mike was the one that had the concept of, let's pull back the curtain. We have a lot of this clubhouse footage with guys, sort of showing who they really were. And I really credit Mike with the one that sort of broke Schmidt, down for the fans. You got to see the real Mike Schmidt in the clubhouse. And that was the beginning of this whole thing. Again, David Montgomery bought into the idea of let's show the fans a lot more of what our players are really like instead of just home runs and strikeouts and things like that. And so that's when I began shooting all the stuff for those home companions. And the players knew that if there was something inappropriate or if something that nobody should ever see, it would never make it to the editor, whoever was putting the highlight film together. I just wouldn't even give them that footage because I would shoot stuff and then we'd send it up to Mike's company in New York. And then after a while, we just started doing it ourselves. And they were pretty confident that there nothing inappropriate would ever, see the light of day. And that's kind of, how we maintain the trust of the players and, how we do it to this day even.
Mm-hmm. You also did a similar video on Steve Carlton after he was released by the Phillies in 1986. And that one must have been pretty difficult emotionally because he was so instrumental in the success of the Phillies for such a long time. And I know Bill Giles really took that hard. And I'd imagine a lot of people took that release hard. Tell us about that video.
Well, that was before the Mike Schmidt video. So the 1986 highlight film really was done by Major League Productions. But I actually did a Steve Carlton biography video in '94, which was the year he went into Cooperstown. And that was more of a behind the scenes. And I was very fortunate to have been befriended by Steve over the years. The nice thing about being in the video room is that on days when pitchers don't start, they have the option of hanging out back there. And Steve Carlton would be there 4 out of 5 days a week. And I learned more baseball just by sitting and listening to him talk about it. But he was also very much a Renaissance man and maybe one of the funniest Phillies that was ever around in the 37 years I've been there. Most fans cannot believe that Steve Carlton is a funny guy, but he was hilarious. And we would sit back and talk about, his, Caddyshack and Animal House, and he could quote all those movies, as well as quoted, literature and fine wines and foods and everything. So Lefty was a very interesting guy, and when he was released in 1986, it was very difficult because the Mets had about a 20-game lead on us, and we knew we weren't going to win that year. And there was, it was obvious that Steve's skills had deteriorated, and he was not effective at all. But we thought, he would last till the end of the season, and then, that would be the end of Steve Carlton's career as a Philly. And instead, he was released in mid-season, and it was on a day that the team left town. So his teammates never got to say goodbye to him, and that was really tough. So when the team came back to town, I went around with just a personal camcorder, and I said, anybody want to leave Lefty a wish and a farewell? And the whole team got individually sent him a message wishing him well, thanking him for all the guidance he'd given them over the years, thanking him for the meals he bought for the rookies and so forth. And we sent it to Steve, who at that time was still unsigned. He wound up signing with the Giants shortly thereafter. But he was so appreciative that his teammates took the time to say goodbye to him. And I was very proud that I was part of that because he was a beloved teammate by everybody. And for those of us that worked there, we all loved Lefty. He was a great guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I was referring to the one you did in '94.
Right.
Was that titled Lefty?
Yeah, it was Lefty, and it was funny because we went out to Lefty's house in Colorado, my wife and I, in 1993, when the team was in Colorado, and we went out with the team and then rented a car and drove down to Durango, which was pretty much the length of the state, which was a beautiful drive. And we went to his house, which had recently been finished up in the mountains. And there were all these crazy reports that he lived in a bunker and he was a wild eccentric. And it wasn't true at all. He lived in sort of a geosotic dome. There were two sides of the house that were wide open that had these giant picture windows that looked out onto the Colorado mountains. It was a beautiful place. Mm-hmm. And basically what we did was, he had agreed to do a biographical tape. So I said, well, we'll just shoot the interviews at your house. And my wife suggested, why don't you guys just walk through the woods together? So that's what it was. it was the two of us. I had a camera on my shoulder, and he just, picked the subject and talked about it, and we walked all around. So I wanted to call it a walk in the woods with Lefty, and that was vetoed, but it wound up being, I think, the Life and Times of Steve Carlton or something like that. But it was called Lefty, the Life and Times. And I remember doing interviews with all the guys he played with, like Timmy McCarver and Larry Christensen and Schmitty and all those guys. And we got Pete Rose on there, and they all talked about what a great teammate Steve was, and obviously a great competitor and a champion.
Now, you mentioned the video yearbooks, the home companions, and
right.
I guess you said that started in '88, and then you went solo shortly after that. You were doing all that work as a part-timer, weren't you?
Yeah, I went full-time with the Phillies in 1991. And that was, I just had my 25th anniversary a few years ago of that. But yeah, I was there for about 9 years, and then I went full-time in 91.
Well, that must have been a lot of work. What's your timetable? I mean, doesn't the Phillies merchandising want to get that thing out for Christmas? So you have
and you know what? So those years are difficult. And to tell you a funny story, I mean, we do try to get them out for the holidays. The last couple of years, I have requested that we wait until the winter meetings are over and we see if we make a move. And this year, the last couple of years, I haven't finished them until February 1st. And this year was great because Gabe really took everybody by surprise at how much there was to him. I mean, there's been so many managerial changes and moves that were made in the off season that weren't necessarily part of the story for the upcoming year. But with Gabe, he was just so engaging and interesting of a guy. And literally from the day he had his press conference, he stayed in town, and every day he was somewhere else, and he was meeting people, and he wanted to absorb the whole Philadelphia experience, and he picked a great time to do it with what happened with the Eagles, and he got to see Philadelphia sports at its best, and he totally embraced it and brought a lot of that to spring training with him. But getting back to your original question, I remember in 2008, we had to have the video yearbook. We changed the name of it to video yearbook, and we had to have it finished by December 1st in order to have it available for retail for the holidays. And the tricky part of that is I didn't want to start working on it until the story was completely over. And of course, it wasn't completely over till Halloween. And so I literally had 1 month from start to finish to do this thing. And I remember, for those who've watched these, we try to get a narrator from the team, either from the team or one of the broadcasters or somebody that was personally involved in the story, and we tell it from their point of view. And I remember as 2008 began to come to a close, I said, okay, the one guy I'd really like to have narrate this is Brad Lidge. Mm-hmm. And Brad is like the nicest guy in the planet, and I knew he wouldn't say no to it. But at the same time, I didn't want to ask him while he had yet to blow a save, because I could see asking him to do it, and that night he goes out and blows a save. And then, I'm not necessarily superstitious, but that was one thing I was very frightened of. But I had to at least pin him down, so I waited till we won the pennant. And I said, Brad, can you do me a favor? I'd love for you to narrate the highlight film. And he was very embarrassed. He goes, oh, it shouldn't be me. It should be somebody like Pat Burrell or Jimmy or Chase. And I said, well, all those guys have done it already, and I'd love to do it from your perspective because this is your first year as a Philly, and that's kind of a neat part of the story. And he agreed to do it, and he said, I can't come to Philadelphia. I said, don't worry, you can do it from your home in Denver. And lo and behold, we win the World Series, and we go through the parade and everything, and then it came time to start putting it together. And pretty much it was 18-hour days the whole time. And I remember we had to do Brad's voiceover with me on the telephone listening to it. And, of course, over the telephone, you really can't hear the quality. You can't hear the inflection. it sounded good, but I wasn't sure. And he did it in a studio there. And the next day they sent me, a digital copy of it, and I listened to it. And I'm like, oh my God, he nailed it. It was really terrific. So once we had that done, which was about on November 10th, then it just became, hours and hours of editing the story and putting it together. But that was a labor of love because it's the one that, it's the one happy ending that we all wanted to do. And, I was so excited to be able to work on that. I wasn't here in 1980, obviously. I was in the stands that day, but it was just so much fun to work on the final piece of the championship. And, to me, that parade was just as great as the Eagles parade in that there were so many happy people flooding the streets, and it was just a blast. So it was very rewarding, even though it was a short window we had to put it together.
Well, you said that the 2008 video was a labor of love. I got to tell you, I think just about all the work you've done is a labor of love. I have only written script and helped produce one video in my lifetime.
Right.
And obviously I was a novice and I had people who were experienced walking me through, but it was exhausting. I mean, even for me, it was just part of that. You got to storyboard it, and even with the digital stuff we have now, it was really, really time consuming. I'm very proud of the product. It's only a 20-minute documentary about Anthracite League baseball up here in northeastern Pennsylvania. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
Yes,
Dan, of all the videos you've written and produced for the Phillies, which one was your favorite and why?
Well, I'll tell you what it was, and you touched on it before. The '93 guys. I was lucky enough I was sort of in my heyday then. I was at that point. We were doing the Home Companions. I would produce it and edit it and shoot it myself. Mike Tolan was still writing it, but Mike wasn't here that much. And, he would follow the team from the West Coast and say, what about this? What about that? And I'm like, this story's telling itself. It's not going to be hard to do. There's so many exciting moments. But back then, I would be in the video room with my camera, and there were so many walk-offs. There were so many great moments in that season. The 4:40 in the morning game. Half the time, the guys would be back in the video room clowning around. I'd be shooting them. Somebody would hit a walk-off home run, and we'd all run out in the clubhouse like maniacs. And I was lucky enough to be the fly on the wall that got all that stuff.
Wow.
And a lot of that didn't make it into the 1993 Home Companion. And then back in those days, the rules were we were not allowed to do the postseason. Major League Baseball would let us do the Home Companion, but if the team got to the postseason, they would do the postseason video. And they really concentrated more on the World Series than the playoffs. And to me, the Atlanta NLCS was the greatest series in Phillies history because Atlanta was such an overwhelming team, and we were total underdogs, and we somehow won that and, finished it back at Veterans Stadium in one of the great games of all time with, Mitch Williams getting a 1-2-3 ninth inning and everybody going crazy. And that whole team got to celebrate in front of the fans that had been with them from the first game. And it was so much fun to be a part of that. So when the 10th anniversary came around, I said, okay, I want to do my own video on this. Mm-hmm. And we're going to call it High Hopes because we got Harry singing High Hopes in the clubhouse in Pittsburgh when they won the National League East. Mm-hmm. And it starts with that. And it's narrated by Larry Anderson and John Kruk. So you get two guys, an offensive player and a pitcher telling the story of that team through their experience. And there was so much footage that we hadn't used before. And then all those postseason games we got to do in detail and how we won them and the big moments. And that was more fun for me to do, even though we didn't, get the big prize. But the fact that, as I believe Schilling was quoted as saying, for 2 weeks there, we were America's team. And everybody, in America could identify with that crazy 93 Phillies team. And really, it reminded me a little bit of the Super Bowl the World Series did, in that we had two heavyweight fighters just going at it. There wasn't any defense in any of those games. And, you know, it was just the fact that our bullpen completely ran out of gas by the end of it, or we might have pulled the greatest upset in sports history, because the Blue Jays that year were essentially an all-star team. And we came very close to you know, sending it to Game 7, and who knows what would have happened. But that was so much fun to do, because a lot of those guys were my friends and still are. And, you know, you can see what happened when we lost Darren this year, you know, the importance of him in all our lives. And, you know, the fact that Crucky's back here, you know, with the Phillies it's just a good thing. I mean, it was such a big and important event in Philadelphia sports history, and it was just so much fun to document it.
Mm-hmm. I'd imagine that a lot of that tape got left on the cutting room floor with that motley crew. I mean, you can't really give a lot of the clubhouse stuff with those guys.
Yeah, and they sort of knew to behave when the camera was around, and so, you know, there were a few expletives in that clubhouse, but for the most part, they were just very, very rowdy, and you know, that translated on the way they played the game. I think it intimidated a lot of their opponents that year. Like, there was something about that team that people didn't want to mess with them. And, you know, it started in spring training when there were 2 or 3 brawls, and it continued throughout. You know, they started the season, I guess, 9-1 and never looked back. And it was fun to be a part of that ride. It was just fun.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It sounds like the most demanding video that you did was the 2008 one. Is that correct?
Well, no, you know what? It's funny, because you talk about time consuming, and I'd say the first 8 or 9 years I did, it would be sleepless nights, and you keep thinking about, well, maybe if I should change this, or if I should add that, or maybe we should talk about this. And it's to the point now that 2008 season literally told its own story. I mean, the season itself was great. You know, we had to come back at the end to take over the National League East, and there were so many great players on that team, and it really wasn't hard to put that together at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you could hear it, but I have an angry dachshund upstairs that's barking at something. I apologize for that.
Hey, he's got it right, you know. So what was the most demanding video you did?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, the 93 Home Companion was probably the most demanding, because my editing equipment was in Fanavision, and I could not edit until the game was over. So, and also all our tape stock was down in my office, which was in the basement of the vet. I would have to put all the tapes I was going to edit with that night on a cart and boxes, take it up to Fanavision when the game ended, and edit till about 5 in the morning. And that got crazy. And, you know, then when we knew we were probably going to be in the postseason, it got even crazier, because we just began to run out of time, and the editing was a lot more tedious then, because it was just tape to tape. And there were many times when I'd fall asleep at 5 in the morning and wake up in Fanavision with the sun coming up, going, this is difficult. But you know,
so you're spending a lot of time with those 93 guys that used to sleep over in the locker room in the clubhouse anyway.
Absolutely.
That's wild.
Absolutely. Yep.
How about the most emotional video, Dan?
Wow. Well, you were part of one of them, which was they said we couldn't play, the story of the Philadelphia Stars, which really was one of my favorite things to have done. And the backstory behind that was in 1997, when we retired Jackie Robinson's number throughout baseball. The Phillies invited the remaining members of the Philadelphia Stars to Veterans Stadium, and they were saluted on the field, and there wasn't much thought about it afterwards. And then a couple guys from the Phillies, Rob Halladay and Gene Diaz, became friendly with these gentlemen, and they would bring them back once a year for Jackie Robinson Day, and these guys would sit and tell stories that were fascinating. And as you well know, because you've interviewed them and you got to know these guys, And I
Great,
remember
great
Rob
piece.
Holiday came up to me and said, we got to get these guys on tape. And so it was 2003 in November. The vet was going to be standing for another 2 months. And we invited these gentlemen down to the visiting football clubhouse and just set them up 5 chairs and let them speak. And it went for about 2 or 3 hours. Fascinating stories, and they all bounced off remembrances with each other and stuff. And it was great. And I remember at the time thinking, boy, this is going to make a great video. But we had the situation of, 1, I was working on the 93 10-year reunion. 2, I was working on a history of the vet documentary. And 3, I was working on a building of Citizens Bank Park documentary. So we got totally caught up in all these projects. And this footage just laid around for a couple of years. And one day I got a call from Bill Cash, who was one of the catchers from the Philadelphia Stars, and he said, hey, I'm speaking in a school, and I was wondering if you had any tape from that day that you sat us down. And I said, yeah, let me find it for you. And I started looking at it. I said, this stuff is so good. We got to do something with it. So we contacted each of the gentlemen individually, went to their homes, invited them to the ballpark, and let them talk more about their story. And then in 2006, Ryan Howard was elected Rookie of the Year, and we had the idea of bringing Ryan out to the Philadelphia Stars Memorial Park at 44th and Parkside, and we brought Stanley Glenn to meet him and walk him around the monuments and tell him stories. And I said, okay, we got to do something with this. So we put together a documentary about the Philadelphia Stars, and I was very proud to work on that because we got to tell really one of the unknown stories of baseball, which was the Negro Leagues in Philadelphia, which most people hadn't even known about back then. And I appreciate you helping me out with that. You contributed an interview, which was very enlightening, and it was just a good story to tell, and it was very satisfying to work on that one.
I had
and
the
emotional.
privilege. I agree with that. I had the privilege of being a moderator at 2 panel discussions with different combinations of those guys. And they played off each other so well as and that film, that discussion, it seems like it was just seamless because it doesn't look like you had to do much editing on that. Because they played off each other so well, and some of the the memories that they gave were just so profound and also so tragic, and yet the Stanley Glenn, I think, really spoke for them all. He used to have a phrase. He said, "Ain't no one ever going to take away my happiness." And they
lived that.
Was,
they all
lived it.
All the gentlemen I met lived that to the hilt. There wasn't a lot of bitterness. It was all like, hey, we got to play baseball for a living, and it was fun. And they, I wish I could have seen them. That was the one thing. There was no film of the Philadelphia Stars that I could find, and that I wish we were able to dig up, but couldn't come up with it.
Yeah, those gentlemen genuinely loved the game, and the only regret that I have is that Gene Benson, I only got to talk with him once, and it was for 3 hours, and I felt like I was. That's the closest I ever came to Jackie Robinson, because Gene Benson and Jackie Robinson were roommates before Robinson signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers, and Gene Benson prepared him. Prepared him for what he was going to be up against. And he was just such a wonderful gentleman and a wealth of knowledge. But my only regret is that, he didn't live longer, because he would have been, a wonderful addition to that film. I know that the Phillies get... I'm sorry?
He is on there. Very briefly,
is he on there?
He was on there from 1998, I believe, and it was shot a couple months before he passed, and he was in the dugout, and he talked about Jackie and how he was very upset that, and this is back in the mid-'90s, that the modern black player did not know much about Jackie Robinson.
I do remember
and as
that.
he put
right.
it, he said he gave his life for them, and
Yeah.
he was upset about that. And I think that's one of the wrongs that has been righted by Major League Baseball is when they retired Jackie's number and then made sure that everybody knew what Jackie went through and how important of a character he was, not in only just baseball, but America itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, and we dealt with that in the documentary. They all admitted that once Jackie made it to the big leagues, it really was the end of the Negro Leagues because
right.
once the owners realized they could improve their team by dipping into the pool of black players, they all did. And they took the best players from the Negro Leagues and kind of, left it on its own, and it only lasted a few more years after that. So, but nobody regrets that, of course. They were very proud when Jackie went to the Dodgers.
Absolutely, because it was opening the doors for them for a Major League Baseball career. Well, you were talking about some of the most emotional filming you did. I know that the Phillies gave you an emotional experience in 2011. At the time, your son Cole was a third baseman and pitcher at Ocean City High School in New Jersey, and he picked the Red Raiders to a state playoff berth the previous year. I guess that was his junior year.
Yes.
And unbeknownst to you, the Phillies intended to make him their final pick in the June 2011 amateur draft. Tell us how you found out about that.
Well, they tricked me. They said, we're going to – they said they were going to do something once the final pick was made. They were going to honor either Pat Gillick or somebody in the room. They said, make sure you get a camera up there. So I'm up there, and then they announced with the last pick in the draft, the Phillies choose my son. So it was that was a blind side there, and that was a very nice gesture on their part, and that was quite thrilling, to be honest with you.
That's neat. What projects do you have planned for the future, Dan?
That's a good question. You know what I want to do? I want to do a Mike Schmidt biography, and I've been collecting interviews over the last couple of years of guys that played against Schmitty, because we have all his teammates pretty much on board. Although 2 years ago I was able to get Denny Doyle, which was really interesting, because Denny was there when Mike broke in. So he saw the origins of Larry Boa and Mike Schmidt together as the left side of the infield. And I just kind of want to tell the story where Mike Tolan left off, which was, in 1987, which was 31 years ago. And it's like, let's pick up where Mike is now, because I think Mike is in a much better place than he was back then. I think Mike was one of those guys who will probably admit that he was never comfortable in the spotlight, never comfortable in the public eye, and, was very introverted and, he enjoyed his privacy a lot. And now he's sort of enjoying being Mike Schmidt, which it's cool because we interviewed Timmy last year, McCarver, and he said Mike's friends are so happy that he's kind of at peace now with his whole life and what's happened with everything. And I think it shows on the broadcast. I think it's great that Mike is there on Saturday and Sundays. And as he puts it, I feel like, I'm just sitting on the living room couch talking baseball. And so I'd love to do it like a follow-up to the Mike Schmidt home run hitter, to Mike Schmidt, the man, the athlete, and the Philadelphia legend. And I haven't sat down and started planning it yet, but I've been collecting all this footage so I could eventually do that someday. So that might be, I figure I'm good for a couple more years of doing this, and I'd like that to maybe be my swan song with the Phillies, is to do the Mike Schmidt story.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I think that would be very much appreciated by so many of the fans. You're right. I mean, since Schmitty has joined the broadcast team on the weekends, he's a pretty funny guy, and people are hearing that. Very knowledgeable guy. He knows how to let the game breathe, which a lot of people don't do in the broadcast booth. And I really feel that, he really is developing a close enough relationship with people that he just may become that beloved figure, that so many of us always wanted for him.
Exactly.
A lot like Ashburn was. So, I hope you do the film. I mean, I think it would be a nice capstone.
And it's, the neat thing about Schmitty is that he is 100% invested as a lifetime Philly. He never played for anybody else, and his love of the team still shows, and his love of these guys. And he comes down every year to spring training, gets in uniform for a couple of weeks, and rubs elbows with them, and talks hitting with the guys. And you could tell he's invested. I remember at the beginning of last year, all he talked about was this Reese Hoskins kid, and I can't wait to see him come up. And he's such a wonderful young man, and I think he's going to be a good one. And all of a sudden, Reese comes up, and boy, was Schmitty right about that. And you could tell Mike was proud of that, and he was proud of his relationship with Reese, and it was cool. It was a neat thing to watch, and luckily the fans get to share that with him, which is it's a terrific thing.
It is, and I think he, it's more than being at peace with his career. It's finding the right spot for him in the organization. Yep. I mean, after he retired, I know he really wanted to be the general manager, and then he really kind of felt at a loss of what his relationship was going to be with the team. He tried the broadcasting with Prism for a while, and then he just kind of moved on, and I think he needed to do that. But now he's back. He contributes to the organization in so many ways that, again, I think he really does have the potential to be a beloved figure. And I hope I'm right about that. But Dan, thanks for being with us, and for all the great memories you've preserved for Philly fans over the years. You truly are a very valuable member of their family.
Well, I appreciate that. It's been a lot of fun. That's the best way I can put it. A lot of fun.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.